Well, like starting off the stream with cranking your neck a bit, huh? Just have a nice cup of milk. Okay. Let me fix my lighting in a sec, but before we do that, I'm just gonna pause this a little bit. That away. Oh my gosh. Oh, that was embarrassing. Okay, let's try that again. Thanks, Epi Timmy. I totally did the wrong scroll there. We're gonna do that all over again. Thank you so much, Timmy. I totally did the wrong scroll. Hello and welcome to the Stream Parson podcast. And today, we're gonna talk about perspective. Now, you're probably wondering, what the hell is perspective? That's probably what you're wondering. And the best way to define perspective is the way you can see a concept or the world, or however you want to fill in the blank for the last part. It's the way of seeing, right? And to really see, right? So this is kind of a part 2 to my first podcast, which was how to knowledge, and I kind of cover a little bit of that because it is relevant to this podcast as well. So, maybe sometime after this, you can go check out last week's stream, which, is my segue into talk about how, like, I do these streaming Parson podcasts every Monday. At least that's kind of the plan for the next while, from about 4 o'clock Pacific time to 6 o'clock, or 5:30. I'm not going to podcast for 2 hours. About 4 o'clock to 5:30. And so, with that being said, I could do a quick kind of review of the last week's stream. So basically, when I did my how to knowledge, the fundamental question I was asking was, what makes something worth knowing? And a big part of that was knowledge needs to not just be true, which I know a lot of people get focused on, and then people have truth debates all the time, whether something is true and something is false. And while that is while that's important and all, that can't be the only thing that's useful about knowledge, right? That can't be the only thing that makes knowledge worth knowing. It can't just be that it's true. And so I use the THINK acronym in regards to knowledge in general, right? Whether something, it being true is important, but it also has to be helpful, it has to be inspiring, it has to be necessary, and it has to be kind, right? And so knowledge as a whole is like that. And so what I was mainly getting at was that when you acquire knowledge, you must be able to apply it in a way that's, beneficial to your fellow man. That was fundamentally what I was getting at. So that was last week's stream. That was kind of what I talked about with knowledge as a whole. With that being said, I'm going to bring up something that goes beyond knowledge, right? And the differentiation between knowledge and wisdom. And of course, the title is kind of a dead giveaway of this differentiation, right? Of what divides knowledge and wisdom. Now, I would say that there are 3 things that constitute knowledge. Or sorry, there are 3 things that constitute wisdom and what makes wisdom, right? Now, there are 3 primary elements. The first one is kind of obvious. We've just talked about it. That would be knowledge, right? In order to have wisdom, you got to know stuff, right? So that's kind of important, right? Knowledge is important to wisdom. But as I mentioned with the How to Knowledge podcast, and it's definitely true due to our modern era, just like how the ancient Greeks wrestled with this, it's something we have to wrestle with today, and that is knowledge is easy to acquire, right? We live in the internet era. You can basically know anything because the internet will know it for you, and you can just look it up. You can know anything, basically. And so that's the first part of what constitutes wisdom. But wisdom has to be much more than that, right? Because people can know a lot of bad things, or people can know a lot of ways of hurting people, right? There's a lot of knowledge that's not beneficial to human beings, right? There's the old saying, for every cure you find 1,000 ways to die, right? So, you can know a lot of bad things. That's kind of the whole idea of that. And, for if you want, the more you want to be helpful, you can also find ways of being destructive. So there's the other elements that you need for what constitutes wisdom. And the second one is, I would say, life experience. Now, the thing about life experience, you can't really do a podcast on life experience, because life experience is just one of those things that comes with, well, life experience, with living your life and learning, going out, trying to apply what you know, and you learn what works and you learn what doesn't, right? It's kind of how life experience works, right? And no one can really teach you that. That's something you have to go out and find, right? And so the idea is, as young people, and one of the beauties of being a young adult is that's like the prime of going on your adventure, right? You can go on your adventure and you learn about the things that do and don't work based on the knowledge you've accumulated in your younger years. You, as a young adult, is the prime time to kind of go on your adventure and see what sticks and what doesn't. And so that's the kind of thing that you can, it's not something that's not something anyone can teach you, right? It's something you just have to find for yourself. So first we have knowledge, and then we have life experience. And the idea is that the third thing will come up naturally from your adventure and acquiring your life experience is perspective. Now, with that being said, this kind of comes full circle to the thing I talked about last week with how knowledge can be beneficial to your fellow, human beings, right? And so that is what makes something worth knowing. And wisdom is how you live that out, right? And you need those other elements of life experience, which you figure out what does and doesn't work. And then perspective, how you can perceive it through not just your own eyes, but then through the eyes of others. And that's a big thing, right? So, with the basic definitions kind of laid out, you're probably wondering why I'm talking about this. Why would I need to talk about this? And my answer to that is going to be an answer that pisses you off. And it's just kind of how it is. I feel as if, like, especially in my age group, my generation, and I see this a lot in younger people too, is that we really have a lack of perspective. We just have a lack of perspective about all kinds of things, right? And so because of that is what has led to a lot of conflict between, like, you've seen the memes of like boomers versus millennials. You've seen the memes, right? And the idea is that happens because there's a lack of perspective. And now there is a somewhat of a lack of perspective from the older generation, but I'm going to talk from the younger generation first, because they're easier to talk about, because I too am guilty of this. And so the problem with the younger generation and the lack of perspective is the idea that, let's say your parents tell you you should behave a certain way, and you start telling them something like, oh, but this is the 21st century, not the 1970s, things are different now, which is true. But when your parents are telling you, certain ways to live and how to, pick up certain habits and whatnot, your parents tell you that because your parents want to protect you from making dumb mistakes, right? But at the same time, what the older generation forgets about, or what they assume but isn't true, is that you have the life experience to develop the discernment to know what they say is valid, right? Because the life experience is lacking between, your parents and yourself. And so the problem your parents end up running into is that they assume you have their life experience, but you don't, right? You're not your parents. You're not them. So you don't have the life experience they do. And so when parents tend to say like, oh, this is how we've done things and it worked. Well, that's also because you've had the time to hash out all the stuff that doesn't work. A young person can't just take that at face value. So that's the part where the older generation stumbles, right? They assume that the younger generation has the life experience. But this is where the younger generation needs to understand that, like, as you acquire life experience, you would start seeing things from a different perspective. Everything is not just something out of a book, right? Or out of an ideology someone told you, but rather it's something you've experienced and therefore you can make real sense of. And so an example of this is I was looking at this like article, not article, it's not an official article, but basically it's a bunch of people on BuzzFeed kind of talking about like things that they thought was cool as a kid, and then that changed as they were an adult. And one that really stuck in mind was when people were talking about movies, right? Now, when you're a kid, and this guy made this kind of illustration. He's like, when you're a kid and you watch Lord of the Rings, right? When you were a kid, you wish you were one of the elves. Because like the elves are freaking awesome, right? They're like these badass warriors, with the sick ass archery skills, and Legolas just kicks all kinds of ass in the movies, right? And you wish I wish I was an elf, because being an elf would be awesome, right? But then you get older, and then everybody goes like, you know what? I wish I were a hobbit. You're probably wondering why would anyone wish they were a hobbit? But that's because the hobbit, all they do is just go about their lives, farm every day, eat, and then go sleep. And their whole lives revolves around farming, eating, and sleeping, right? That's why they have, breakfast, second breakfast, 11 Z's lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, supper, right? And so life experience and perspective has changed, what would be the cool thing to be as you get older. But that comes with time, right? And so that was one example that really stuck out to me because I thought that was hilarious, right? It's like, yeah, that's kind of true. In my 30s, I'm kind of like, it would be nice to kind of be like a hobbit, just kind of go through the motions of life and just eat, sleep, and do my work that's needed, and that not worry about all the other stuff, right? I don't care if I had superpowers and stuff. I just kind of want to have a peace of mind, right? And just kind of live a quiet life, right? That's all we all kind of wish, which it's not something that really exists, right? Because the way the world is, with all the different crises going on, you think of like the Afghanistan conflict or whatever, right? You think of like economic collapse and all that stuff. It's hard to have a peace of mind, right? But that's something we all wish for. And so that's the stumbling block for a lot of young people when it comes to needing perspective, is that it's hard for a young person to grasp something because you don't have the life experience, and we don't have that easy connection to like a time that is long gone for us, right? So when your parents are going like, oh, you shouldn't do it this way, you should do things this way or whatever, right? It's so easy to be like, oh, like you're just some boomer that doesn't know what they're talking about, right? Things are different now, right? And of course, from the flip side, the older generation, they get too stuck on relying on life experience, right? Well, I've already lived through this. I know exactly how this is gonna go down if you go down this route, right? Yada yada yada. The older generation is too caught up on life experience. This is where the wisdom thing needs the three elements kind of in balance, right? It needs the knowledge, it needs the life experience, and it needs the perspective. And it needs them in a balance too, right? And so the older generation, they rely too much on the life experience aspect. And because they have the life experience, they've been through stuff in their lives, then therefore their life experience is authority, right? And that's a dangerous way to go down too, for its own reasons, right? Because then not everybody can relate. It's not something that is true for everyone, kind of thing, going back to the knowledge thing, right? And so that doesn't really that doesn't really hold, and you can't convince people with your life experiences alone, right? And so the older generation, they'll think about how, like, oh, like, you don't know anything, right? That's the thing they'll always yell, like, complain about young people. You don't know anything, right? And that's relying too much on the life experience, right? So this is where perspective is very important. And a way that I like to look at perspective is the prerequisite of things like sympathy and empathy, right? And you hear lots of stuff about the importance of empathy, right? And how if we want to be better, if we want our society to improve, we need more empathy. We need more empathy, right? To know what it's like to be in someone else's shoes, yada yada yada, right? You've probably heard the whole ramble about that. Well, that's true and all, but you got to take a step back and look at perspective and how perspective plays into sympathy and empathy. And so let me sidetrack a bit here to kind of explain why that's the case. And that's because empathy, if you rely too much on empathy and you don't take a more objective approach when you're, wanting to relate to someone else's, as they struggle through life, you might end up getting too emotionally involved. Sorry about that. Anyway, you might get too emotionally involved to the point that your emotions might blind you. And there's a lot of ancient proverbs, whether it's the Bible or other, you know, sage like wisdom. Buddhism has this too. The idea that, you can't let your emotions blind you because your heart can deceive you, right? Because your heart might want something, and it's like that passionate impulse, right? That's a more Buddhist idea. Is the passionate impulses can actually lead you in a bad direction, right? That was one of the four pillars of Buddhism, by the way, right? The danger of your what did Buddha actually call it? He called it I can't remember what he called it. Maybe it is he just calls it passion, right? And I'm gonna call it the the impulse of passion, right? Because your passions can be impulsive. This is actually how people. This is actually how people can easily fall into, like, falling with a bad crowd or addictions even, right? It's an impulsive passion. So when something makes you feel good, and then you continuously want that, even if it's not always good for you, and then that leads to a type of addiction, right? And this tends to happen with things that are generally pretty good, right? Say watching movies and your entertainment, right? But if you get too caught up in just always needing to be entertained, then you have a problem, right? And so the impulsive passion is something you have to watch. We have to watch out for. And empathy, it if we rely too much on our compassion nature, and then that can develop, the impulsive passions can develop, and then empathy ends up actually working against you, in that you just want to feel for your friends and for others, even if you know what they're doing is wrong, or even if what they're doing is bad for you and your your friend circle, your family, or whatever, right? But you want to, but no, but I have to like it. I have to make sure they're like it's okay for them and whatever, right? And but loving them is more important, da 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 da, right? And all the excuses we come up sometimes to justify when we defend bad ideas or defend things that are not good, right? And that's the impulsive passion, which is something we have to watch out for. What perspective allows us to do is to step back a bit and not allow our passions to just overrule everything, right? Like logical thought. Now, of course, you can't rely on perspective alone, right? Once again, life experience and knowledge also come into play, but we'll put that to the side for now. And what perspective allows us to do is to just be like, allow you to see things, but try not to be emotionally invested in it. Now, that's important because let's say you have to do a thought experiment with somebody, right? And we'll do some, and that's kind of what we're going to do for the bulk of the podcast is kind of just play around thought experiments. And when we talk about perspective, I kind of want to use these kind of examples to like, this is how we develop perspective, right? And then perspective allows us to be more knowledgeable, develop life experience, and, all the other things, right? How to be more empathetic and so on. But anyway, so you have to be able to look at things without your biases. And that's not easy, right? But the twist on perspective is that if you can look at something objectively and then see where your bias plays into it, and to be aware of how your biases affect your perspective and how you may view someone else's perspective, that will grant you a lot of ability to relate to people. And so that's something I kind of want to do today is for us to really kind of experiment with that. And I think it's a fun thought experiment. I think it's something we should do often. If you haven't done, these kind of things yourself, we'll start. You can start here. We can start here, and then you can always do more thought experiments on your own, right? And how to develop perspective. And so the idea is that when you're aware of your biases in what should otherwise be being more objective in your judgments, then that lets you be far more aware of how not only you see the world, but how other people can see the world and how other people don't see the world and so on. And that allows you to relate to people and by extension actually helps you be more empathetic and sympathetic to others. So that's my whole like talk about perspective itself. But without perspective, you might not really understand it. So we're going to do some thought experiments and view how perspective plays out in these thought experiments. All right, so the first one, get ready for some hot takes, by the way, because I mean, the best way to view your own biases is to tackle some hot topics. Am I right? So the first one is making the rich pay more, right? The rich should pay more, right? Heavier taxes on the rich and whatever, right? And it's not just that started an idea that a lot of people have. Now, I know people would deny that what they're thinking is actually this, but then there's also the people who proudly wear it, and then you probably wonder why the hell do you think this is actually a bad idea. And this leads to what is fundamentally socialism. Now, on paper, people think socialism is great, right? Divide up the wealth, right? And so all people can have equal access to all. Well, not equal access, equal outcomes in all things, right? Which is totally different from equal access. Equal outcomes in things, right? And so this usually comes in the discussion where like, oh, there are multi-million and even billion-dollar corporations, right? And there was that whole article that made people really angry with what's that dude's name? The Amazon guy. Where he may very well break the $1 trillion mark. Now that apparently that's a thing, right? Um, but of course, at the same time, it's not like the average Amazon worker makes more than like minimum wage, and now we have this one guy who's sitting on trillions of dollars. And so, on the one hand, yeah, it's kind of not right that one guy just hoards all this money. But on the other hand, it would also be wrong to tell, and I mean, he's an extreme case. Even if you were to talk about like a guy who had a multi-million-dollar business, right, and to tell them, you know, redistribute the wealth, right? It would be wrong to do that. Now, here's a little thought experiment that I'm going to do. Now, this comes from the premise that some people would say, well, there shouldn't be people who have $1 billion, right? They should redistribute all that wealth, and so it should go to the people. And you think that's some people think like, yeah, that wealth should be distributed, but you run into the fundamental problem, which is not really about money, profit, and distribution of wealth, but rather human greed. And that would be the fundamental problem. So here's a little thought experiment, right? Now, it's easy to say that, the owner of the owner of, let's say, McDonald's, right? Sitting on billions of dollars, right? Guys should redistribute the wealth, right? Instead of having $1 billion, because you don't need $1 billion, so you redistribute the wealth. But let me ask you something. Let's say you made $100,000 a year. American. I originally had this thought process in Canadian dollars, which is true in Canadian dollars, but now it's even more so in American dollars because the American dollar is worth more than the Canadian dollar. So let's say you made 100,000 American dollars a year, which sounds like a lot, right? And it is a lot, actually. In most places in the States, minus like New York, and other places, like I think New York is really the only one. Maybe this is true in like some places in California, but California is totally shifted, so you can't really say this about California anymore. But definitely true in New York. It's definitely true in like the eastern seaboard there. So this would also be true of like the state of places along the state of Virginia. This is probably true in Boston. This is probably true in like Florida. Might be true in some parts of Texas. But basically the idea is if you made $100,000 a year American, you could easily live off that kind of money. Hell, you could easily live off half of that. If you made $50,000 a year, you could probably live off of that. But with that being said, let's say you made $100,000 a year. Now, if I went up and told you, oh, you make $100,000 a year, you should give away $50,000 a year, half of what you make. No questions asked. You don't ask me what it's going to. You just have to give it away, right? I could just tell you it goes to the people, but even that would be problematic, right? Let's say no questions asked. You have to give away half of what you make, because the fact of the matter is, if you made $100,000 a year, you could live off half of that easily. You could easily live off $50,000 a year in America. So you don't even need the extra $50,000 you have, right? That you're making. If you make $100,000 a year, but you can live off $50,000, you don't really need the other $50,000. So why don't you just give it away, no questions asked? Would you do it? You're more than welcome to answer these questions. I'll eat this donut while I wait for your response. Long John. If you don't know what a Long John is, it's basically an eclair without the cream. which I also really like eclairs. Eclairs are amazing, right? Then when you put the right kind of cream in it, like there used to be. Okay, so off topic. So there was this place, this donut place, and they mostly do eclairs of all things, right? It's like an eclair store, but they do like different kinds of chocolates on top as well as the different kind of creams. Holy moly! Like one of the best things they ever have there is like they have this dark chocolate over top, and the eclair is like a strawberry cream. So it's like a strawberry cream with dark chocolate. Oh my gosh, like that is pure bliss. Pure bliss in a nutshell. Only problem is in Vancouver, that stuff ain't cheap, right? It's like, oh my goodness, it's like what, $3 a donut or something like that? It's kind of expensive. It's like $3 a donut or something. But dark chocolate with a strawberry cream eclair is just like, oh, so good. Anyway, so with the thought experiment of if you made $100,000 a year, and I told you that you have to give away half of it, no questions asked, would you do it? No, unless you're a crazy person, you're probably going to answer no, right? I would say no if someone told me that, right? And you wonder, well, why would we all say no? Most of us would say no. Well, it's pretty logical, right? The knowledge part would be, well, why should I give away money? That makes no sense logically, right? Why would I do that, right? I worked for it, therefore it is mine, therefore I can do what I want with it, and part of what I want to do with it is not just give it away, no questions asked, right? That's a logical thing. So that's knowledge. Life experience would be something along the lines of, well, if there's no questions asked of where this money's going, well, that obviously sounds like a scam, right? Like, why are you trying to scam me of my money, right? Look, I've seen cons around, and so I'm not gonna give a con money, right? That's your life experience, probably speaking, right? Now, this is where perspective comes in. That is why. Well, let me before I jump to the perspective part. With that being said, right, the logical part of like, it's your money, so why would you give it away? And life experience would tell you that you be wary of scammers and people just trying to take your money for no reason. Now, you probably said that you wouldn't give away $50,000 a year if you made $100,000 a year. Now, I know a lot of people don't like the thought experiment because they say, well, it should be easier for you to part with your money if you had more money. But life experience would also say, no, that's not true. That is not true at all. The more you have is actually harder to part with, right? And I mean, that's the fundamental idea about like every power-hungry supervillain in every comic book, right? They want more power and they're unwilling to part with it. Even the little bit they were, the little bit they had to start with, they weren't willing to part with that. So, you know, they're not going to part away with power if they had more of it, right? That doesn't make logical sense, right? And so that's where a lot of people lack perspective. And this is where we get into the perspective thing, right? It's easy to say like, oh, people should be more generous with their money and give away more money, to help the people, right? Especially the rich people should be able to do that. But the problem you're running into is not that, oh, there's a problem with distribution of wealth, but rather that some people are greedy, right? Because you're going to run into people that say like, well, why should I do that? Why should I give more money, right? I work for this. This is my profit in the case of businesses. Why should I just give away money? That sounds stupid, right? And so perspective would be understanding that you wouldn't do it. So why should you expect someone else to do it, right? And so going back with the, talking to someone who has way more money than I do, like, there's no way I would try and say to him like, oh man, you make way too much money, right? you have all this extra stuff that nobody needs in their life, right? Why don't you just use your money, give it away to people, and be more generous, right? I would never say that to someone because that sounds ridiculous, and especially when you say it out loud like that, it does sound really stupid, right? And of course, the thing where perspective and even empathy comes in is, well, I wouldn't do it, so why should I expect someone else to do it? And another fun example would be more. This is more of a personal thing. This is not like a thought experiment you have to do, but maybe you can kind of do this little mental exercise yourself as I tell you this story about myself. So this computer I have here, I have a $2,000 computer that I'm using for streaming, right? And gaming and stuff. It's a $2,000 gaming computer. That's what I have here, right? It's a pretty sick ass machine that I have. It's why I like when I stream with Baruka and we did Dead by Daylight streams and you watch his streams versus my streams and my streams are always way better than his as far as video quality is concerned. It's because I work with a far more powerful computer than he does, right? Because I have this like sick ass $2,000 computer. His is pretty good. I think his was like, he built his for like just over, let's say roughly 1,500 Canadian. I think he paid like roughly 1,200 American or something. Mine is like a 1,500 US dollar computer. I should just use US currency all the time instead of using my Canadian money, right? The duck money. Um, but okay, so I have this 1,500 US dollar supercomputer. That's what I have, right? Now, some people have actually gone up to me, more or less. Well, not gone up to me, like, say shit to me on social media or something. People have done this and be like, oh, you're a pastor. You should be using that money to help people, give to the church more and whatever, right? Somebody had the gall to say that. And I'm like, are you for real? Right? Like, you already know how much I give to the church. I give, my regular tithes. I don't go higher than that though, because, I mean, sure, you can call this a moral failing, but, the tithe is the required amount, and I will just do the required amount, right? And I mean, there are a lot of Christians who are a lot more liberal than that, right? That the tithe is not necessary. It's not necessary, right? After all, there's the part in Corinthians about you give what you are able to give, right? And so some people might not be able to give more, i.e., a parent with a young family, right? They might not be able to do 10%. So the fact that I do 10% is already quite a bit. So I already do that. Did people forget that I, volunteer in the Vancouver downtown east side, which is, for all intents and purposes, kind of the slummy part of the city? I give a lot of time. I used to anyway, not so much now, because of, part of it is COVID, and secondly, because I work more, so it's kind of harder to do that. I used to give like 8 hours a week to doing that, like free work, basically, right? I did 8 free hours of labor, right? I used to do that. Now it's like a lot less. It's only like 2 hours, right? It's not even 2 hours. It's like just over. It's like an hour and a half, basically. Basically, as long as one of these podcasts, right? Of volunteering, which is not that long, right? But I do that, right? And other things like that, right? I also spend a great amount of my time doing like other ministries and helping out other people's ministries. Because, like, for example, there's a friend that my mom knows, and she wants me to help. My mom wants me to help out her friend with her like ministry that she does in like various parts of Vancouver where they give out Bibles, whatever, right? And I help out with that too, right? Like, I do my fair share of the Lord's work, right? It's, in my mind, it's no crime that, okay, I do all that already, so why can't I use some of the money I make for myself to buy a mega computer? Why can't I do that, right? And the angry man part of me would say, like, well, who are you to tell me what to do with my money, right? which is a valid claim that anyone would make, right? Who are you to tell me what I do or not do with my money? And so people who accuse you of like being, oh, you're overly greedy or whatever, you should use your money to help more people, blah, 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 give away your money. The mean way of going about it would be like, well, why don't you do more of that, right? I see your nice car, right? And stuff like that, right? That's the mean way of going about it. But of course, when you have perspective and good amount of perspective, then you know how to be graceful about that too and be like, hey, it's not that simple, right? And for instance, you can, and of course, the other danger of this is just like you just end up over justifying yourself, which is something you shouldn't do. But you can justify yourself about some things that you do, right? For example, I can justify myself buying a $1,500 supercomputer, right? I mean, I play amount of computer games, especially with friends, and I use that as an opportunity to do ministry. So in a way, you could say that my superpower computer is a method of ministry, right? Part of it is also this channel, right? If you guys remember, I don't know if some of you guys were around when I used to do this. I used to stream on Twitch, and I used to have a really bad computer compared to the one I have now when I did streaming on Twitch. And oh my lordy, like, it was bad. I don't know what I was thinking at the time, right? And so I used to stream with a really bad computer. And, if I don't know if I have any of those videos on YouTube. I think they're all gone now. And I used to stream on Twitch, but then Twitch had its own problems, so I left Twitch. But I used to do those with like a really bad computer. And it was painful to like go through, right? Because it's like, oh man, like this is so hard. And even the Bible reading streams were choppy. Like, think about that, right? Like the Bible reading stream, similar to these podcasts, is just me and a camera, right? Your computer doesn't need that much power to run a camera, right? And to have the streaming device go. But the computer I had before this one was pretty bad. And so, you know, I like to think of it as an investment, right? With having this higher end computer. And it allows me to do stuff like the streaming Parson reads, right? As it goes through the, shameless plug-in, as I go through the Book of Kings right now, right? And I've read through several other Bible books on this channel already. That would have been way harder with the older computer I had. And so buying a super expensive computer actually was helpful in that, right? And, I like to think that, I'm making an impact in your lives with that. And of course, also other Discord servers and streams that I'm a part of. And there, I like to think that, I'm leading people to Christ step at a time, right? That would not happen if I wasn't willing, if I wasn't going to pay for a super good computer, right? That wouldn't happen because I'd be so limited by the technology that I had in the past. And so perspective allows us to think about, more than immediate things like that. It allows you to think about like, well, what's the bigger picture as well, right? And seeing the world from, more than just your emotional attachment, right? And the other thing that's dangerous about, that impulsive passion that I mentioned before is that is actually what leads to the thing that many people hate about Christians, ironically, right? And that is where people act very self-righteous about, what I think and feel is correct. And if you don't think and feel the same way, you are clearly incorrect because you're unloving, you're unkind, da 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 da, right? You've probably heard that, right? And then of course many people accuse Christians of doing just that, right? And then the irony is that they also end up being unkind, and that's why you can't go around accusing people, right, of everything that's wrong with them, because how does it go? Do not judge lest you be judged, right? Don't look at your brother or sister and say, let me take out that splinter in your eye when there is a log in your own. Remove the log in your eye, and then you will be able to say, let me help you with that splinter. I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but that's how it goes, right? Don't judge lest you be judged. And so perspective allows us to try and get a bigger picture of how things are before you make any judgment, because you don't know whether you're going to fall into the exact same pitfall, right? Which is what happens to people more often than not. So that's thought experiment number 1. I know, a lot of time spent to that one. Well, it's more like 2 because, well, no, it's 1 thought experiment, but then like I ended up telling my own story, which was a continuation of the first one. But anyway, so that's the point. Perspective when it comes to frustrations of, going back with the whole boomer versus millennial thing. Frustrations when your parents can't figure out technology. So I'll tell the personal story first, and then we'll do the thought experiment after. So my dad is an insurance broker. Well, he's a semi-retired insurance broker, but he's more or less an insurance broker. He still does it he just does it to a much smaller degree now, and he just does like a more personal clientele, as opposed to actually working for an insurance firm. As such, when you are an insurance broker, you would think that, hey, this is the kind of job you definitely need a smartphone for, right? My dad, up to right before he retired, he never used a smartphone in his life, more or less, right? So he gets one, and he asks all kinds of questions about how to do this. What's this? What does this do? How my phone doesn't ring properly. Why do you fix this? Or whatever, right? And the part of me wants to be like, damn it, Dad, like it's not that hard to figure out. But on the other hand, it's like, okay, this thing here, has more power than the first spaceship that sent the first people to the moon. Okay, so like, my dad is an old guy dealing with modern technology, and it can be hard sometimes when you're an old guy. And like an old guy, not like when I joke about myself being old. I mean like an actual old guy, right? Like, my dad is by definition old. He's like, seniors discount age. Okay, so my dad falls into that category, and so perspective of why is it that older people struggle with using modern technology, or why older people struggle with memory problems, or whatever, right? Why do older people struggle with stuff that seems obvious to you as a youngster, right? Technology is the easy one. Remembering stuff is another one, right? Like, I made this whole joke that I use pen and paper for everything when I'm playing games and stuff, but I use pen and paper with my parents all the time, right? I have to write stuff down for them all the time because I'm not going to rely on them remembering stuff, right? It's just how it is. And so I write a lot of stuff down because I know that both my parents, have a little bit of faulty memory at times, right? But this is where, perspective comes in, right? And I'm going to give you guys a little thought experiment, Imagine, okay, this is going to require some of your math skills, how good your math skills are, right? Imagine that try to recall what 1 year feels like. See, this is kind of this is gonna be. See, this is not an easy thought experiment because this really works the other way from like if I were to try and explain to an older person than to a younger person. But imagine if you had to sit in a car by yourself, your parents go into a store or something, or you're waiting for somebody doing something in a different shop, right? And I want you to recall that when you were a kid and you're at the mall with your mom or something. You're a kid. You're like 8 years old, right? And you have to wait for your mom as she goes shopping in some store, right? But it's like a women's clothing store, so you have the little kid just sitting outside kind of thing, right? How long does it feel when you're waiting, when you have to wait for your mom in a store, versus let's say you're out shopping, you're in your 20s now. You're out shopping with your friends, with your girlfriend or whatever, and she wants to go check out a store, more women's clothes store, because yes, of course it is. And how long it feels when you gotta wait for her, right? I want you to compare those two scenarios. And I want you to imagine being the 8-year-old and the 25-year-old or whatever, or your own age, I guess, for, those of you younger than 25. You know, how different those two events feel. And of course, like, the way I painted that thought experiment was like, yeah, you can kind of tell the childhood I had, right? Being dragged around a mall while, like, your mom goes shopping in a, you know, women's store, right? Yeah, right. Okay, so those of you that probably have a good idea of this, sometimes I'm streaming like StarCraft or something, and Northern Reflections phones me in the middle of streaming StarCraft. You guys remember that? Yeah, that kind of store. And Northern Reflections never stops calling, right? But anyway, now that I've given you a little bit of time to imagine those two scenarios, what should naturally occur is that when you're the kid, it feels really long, right? Now you wonder why that's the case. Now here's perspective. When you're a kid, time feels a lot slower, right? Because time is a lot more congested. And the reason for this is because you relate time in accordance to your own memories and your own lifespan. Whereas you hear old people all the time talk about how, like, as they get older, time goes faster. But of course, that doesn't make any real sense because, knowledge would tell us that time works in a certain linear fashion. We have seconds, which goes to minutes, which goes to hours, hours go to days, days go to months, etc. Right? And that has always generally been the same, right? Well, minus the whole moving at near light speeds and how relativity works, but we're not talking about that, right? We're talking about life here on Earth, right? So when you're a kid, everything feels like everything takes longer because time is a lot more congested, right? Because when you're a kid, the way you view time is a lot more cramped. Whereas as you get older, time feels just like it's just another part of all the other stuff you already have experienced in life. And so the way I like to work, a simpler way of kind of explaining this, as I would say to some people, and I'm going to say to you now, is that, like, for instance, 1 year, right? How you measure 1 year, you measure it with your own age, right? So 1 year is 133 of my life, right? That's how I would that's how I would view that length of time. So if it's 1 in 33 of my own life, 1 year encapsulates roughly, because of course you don't remember everything, when you're like a baby or something. You only start retaining memories after a certain point in your um, childhood. But for all intents and purposes, like 1 in 33 is that's a pretty small number. But if I talk to like a senior, right, 1 year is a very small number, right? And let's say a person who's like 70 years old, right? 1 out of 70, right? 1 out of 70 is a very tiny number compared to 1 in 33. Heck, 1 in 70 is less than one half of 1 in 33, right? When you look at fractions, right? And so when you understand time in that dimension, right, your perspective of how people view time greatly changes. And of course, the opposite is true when you're looking at a kid, right? That's why kids get frustrated with old people being slow, right? Because for a kid thinks, one like 1 year is already a lot to think of, right? But you get like an 8-year-old. 1 in 8, right, is a way bigger number than 1 in 33. That's like 4 times as big a number, right? If you look at it from a mathematical perspective. And so, the way we view time as we get older changes, right? And so perspective and the way that we see the world around us, it does change quite a bit. And that's something that really, I know that probably blew your minds with that, right? But you think of like, wow, like as you get older, time does feel like it goes faster, because when you have to put 1 year as a ratio to your own age, and as you get older, that ratio, the fraction only gets smaller and smaller, right? And so, because now you're thinking 1 year is less time than it objectively is, right? Because once again, you intrinsically are just scaling it with your own life. That's kind of normal. So you just scale it with your own life, and then as you get older, 1 year starts looking like less and less time, right? Because of that. But I bring up this fun little thought experiment and this little mind-blowing fact is because, that's how, as we have the need to develop perspective for, how we view all kinds of different things like economic principles and, understanding where people come from in life when they're going through different issues or whatever, right? You have to take that step back and look at things from like beyond yourself, right? Because it's so easy to get caught up in what you would do, right? But then you don't know what you would do, right? And so it's easy to do thought experiments, but at the same time, the actuality of, things are not as clear cut as we like them to be. You don't really know what you would do. And that's something that we have to be very graceful to each other about, right? And I think that's another thing about perspective that's very important. And I think it's one of the problems of our society today is that since we've kind of lost the need to develop that perspective, we end up not being very graceful to each other when that's one of the things we need the most, is for us to be graceful to each other. One more thought experiment of, perspective, right? And how you see the world and how other people see the world. I like to do this little exercise. Now, it's kind of hard to do on stream, but what I want you to do, you can do this after the stream or something. Let me just grab a piece of paper. Yes, this requires pen and paper. So, just grab a piece of, yeah, whatever, I'll just use this. So, there are different levels of doing this. And the simple one I like to do is the color addition. And so what you're going to do is you're going to, on one part of your piece of paper from, top to bottom, you're going to write a bunch of different colors, right? So you're going to write like red, blue. I don't have a real table here, so it's going to take me a while to write all this down. Yellow. And I encourage you guys to kind of try this with me. Red, blue, yellow, let's see, purple, orange, green. Let's add some non-primary, secondary colors, so brown. Other colors, I guess. White and black. Even though I know white and black are not colors, but you get the idea. So white and black. And so I have this piece of paper. Oh, that lighting was really bad there for a second. And I kind of write like this, right? And then what you're gonna do is you're gonna write the first thing that comes to mind. Like say it out to yourself kind of thing and be like, okay, what's the first thing that comes to mind when it's like red? So, and just write the first thing that comes to mind with each color. So red, blue, yellow. My list is so bad right now. That was a weird one. So here's my list. And I basically wrote the first things that came to mind. And I know some of it's kind of wimpy. And one, you can kind of see what's on my mind right at the moment, right? You can kind of figure out a bit of my past. You can kind of figure out quite a bit about me, actually, by the first things that come to mind based on this list. I named a bunch of items after thinking of a color. Now, perspective would be that we know that things don't exist in a vacuum, right? And so the exercise was kind of like, when you think of colors, you don't think of, like, if I were to say, like, the color red, you thought of an object. You don't think of, like, the entire, like, just blankness and it's just red, right? You don't think of reality like that. And so perspective plays here in that, you view the world a certain way. And so my list here for red was apple. So, it's one of the first, I'm kind of referring back to my childhood kind of here, right? You're always, when I was a kid, and I think most of us when we were kids, and you were taught like colors, right? Red is usually the first one you learn, and it's usually with an apple, right? Blue is water. I mean, how much water do I drink, right? And I know technically water is clear, but anytime I think of the color blue, water just comes to mind, right? I usually think of like the ocean. Yellow, banana, right? Food on my mind, right? If I can eat something after this podcast, right? Purple, a flower, right? The violet is what I wrote down. Because usually we associate with like, I don't know, I tend to think of like I like purple flowers. I think it's something that I've just always liked. I can't really explain why I do. I just do. And so when I think of the color purple, I think of like purple flowers. Orange, the color orange, like everybody probably thinks that, right? The first thing, if I were to say orange, the first thing you're going to think of is the fruit, right? Because you're probably going to ask me, orange, did you mean the fruit or the color? Probably the first thing you thought was orange, right? And then green, grass. It's an easy one. Alliteration also works too, right? I put a weird one for brown. I put a bear. And I think that's because I recall a memory. I recall when I learned about the color brown in like a book. And like, the brown bear, and there was this book about like all these different animals with these different colors. And the bear one obviously sticks out because first of all, brown bear alliteration works pretty well. And two, I mean the bear looks freaking awesome in that book, right? Even though it's like a kid's book. And I can recall that memory pretty well. And then of course white, a pearl. I don't know why I thought that. I guess it was the first thing that came to mind, right? And then black, I don't know, for some reason I thought dirt. Because I don't know, I was thinking of like color black, and then like I just had this imagery of a person running their hand through dirt. And so I don't know why I thought that. Obviously dirt isn't black. But that's what I thought, right? And the reason I kind of had to do this, and you can do this with all kinds of things, not just colors, right? You can really start to explore your mind when you do this thought experiment and think about like, okay, for example, like emotion words, right? Like anger, what's the first thing you think of? Sadness, what's the first thing you think of? Right? Joy, what is the first thing you think of? Etc., etc. And the point of doing this thought experiment was that, we all think differently, but perspective allows us to catch ourselves where our biases are and let us think about how we would view the world. And it is from there that you can develop how you can relate to other people, right? And so the last little story I'll tell is, well, one thing I do is like I hang out on Discord servers with a bunch of young people because I'm a nerd who sits in front of a computer, but at the same time, social interaction, right? So Discord is a pretty nice, device to use for that, right? I can talk to people from different parts of the world easily in front of my computer, right? And I always tell them, like, as the older guy, I like to hope I can impart wisdom to you by my life experience, but it's not just my life experience is what inspires them, but rather it's the fact that I have perspective in how to talk to young people. Because the thing I always remind myself, and I always make this as a kind of a joke with, some of these guys I hang out with. I always made the joke like, I know how stupid you are. Because I used to be young and stupid. So I know how stupid you are. And so, with that being said, though, I can help you, you know, understand the world from a larger perspective so that we can stop being stupid, right? So that we can move beyond that. And so, I use that part of my past and myself, like, yeah, I know exactly what I know exactly what you think because I used to think that too. And so perspective would be that, like, yeah, I know I know what a young person thinks, and I know what I would do as a young person. Heck, I did some of those things as a young person, right? I say that as if I'm not a young person now, but like, you know what I mean. Um, but that's one of the things that, like, as you develop that kind of, you know, understanding of the world and yourself and other people, that allows you to engage them, right? And I always made this joke about how, like, this is why you guys keep me around, right? Because you guys just suck on my, insights on life, right? Because, part of it is that I've been around and I've seen things and I understand how things are, but not just that. I understand how you feel, right? When some of these guys would tell me things that goes on in their life and, how they have feelings about certain things, whatever. And I would say, like, yeah, I understand, right? Because perspective has allowed me to view what I would do in that scenario and all these thought experiments, right? And that's kind of a reason why we did them today, was just so that, like, when you have to have these kind of talks with people about, like, economics and stuff, and you can think like, wow, what would it be like if I had to do it, or if we had to do it, right, or whatever. And that's something that it's it's not an easy thing to do. Perspective is a very difficult thing to develop, a very difficult skill, you can call it that. It's a very difficult thing to develop, right? And one of the other things too, that part of it is unfortunately because of, like, COVID, but even before that, you can't just blame COVID for it. But, like, part of it is, like, with the internet era, it's so easy to just, like, not go out, right? It's so easy to just, like, get everything from, like, you know, your seat in front of the computer, right? It's so easy to do that. But I think the big danger is that, like, if you don't go out on your adventure, right, you won't develop perspective, right, on top of the life experience. And, you know, the adventure allows you to really interact with the world, right? And people are part of that world, and you have to understand how to interact with them. You know, sure, we all kind of say precious to the socially awkward, you know, buttercups. I'm looking at you, Bernadette, from Found in Three Houses. Like those kind of characters, right? Oh, precious. But at the same time, it's like, no, realistically, you know, you can't live like that, right? We all have to go out there and be contributors to society, because of course, ultimately, we can't just live for ourselves, but we have to live for something greater than ourselves, and it starts with our community, and then you work up from there. And so that doesn't happen overnight, right? But at the same time, it's something we all have to cultivate. So there's no reason to avoid it. Heck, it would be a disservice to yourself to avoid that. And so this is where perspective is very important, because it will allow you the tool. it will grant you the tools to allow you to really engage with other people's lives, and that's part of what being human beings is about, right? On a sad note, I don't know how it is where you live, but in Vancouver, starting today, kind of done this whole mandate about how like no public gatherings for people unless like you have basically a certificate of your vaccination, right? That you've taken all the vaccinations or whatever, and you have to have like you basically get like an ID for it. Not the biggest problem for me, but there are I live with people who aren't vaccinated, right? And so one thing that sucks then is that like for instance my parents can't go out and eat with friends or whatever, right? Heck, I can't even go out and eat with my parents, right? Because they don't have the ID. But think about that for a moment, like just using something like eating out with your friends, and you might not be able to do that here because like let's say some of your friends aren't vaccinated and now you can't eat out with them. Which sounds really terrible because, isn't one of life's greatest joys, if you will, one of the greatest joys in life is just to go out and eat with your friends. I mean, since the caveman days, right? I mean, if you think of it like this, we built civilization on that idea, right? That people flourish when they eat together, right? As a community. The whole caveman's, killing an animal, cooking over a fire, and they're eating and drinking and having a grand old time about that, right? That they killed a big animal and they're eating it, right? Like you see those movies or whatever, right? And you know, isn't that like what we built civilization on? And now apparently there's a soft ban on like eating out with your friends, right? And so I think there's a lack of perspective when people say like, oh, like that's the like this is what we're doing now, right? Like no eating out unless you're vaccinated, whatever, right? And you have proof of it, whatever, right? And so, but at the same time, it's like you've kind of missed the point of what it means to be human. That was why I brought up the illustration, right? Being human, right? Because being human is that like, you know, you want to eating out with your friends is one of the greatest things about being human, right? There's a lot of things that sucks about being human beings, like our mortality and our vulnerabilities. The fact that humans can be pretty terrible at times. But at the same time, there's some great things about it. Community is one of them, right? And so that human interaction and going back to why perspective is important in regards to that is because we all have to do that. And at the same time, it ain't easy because, you don't want to just put your foot in your mouth all the time. So you got to know how to, really communicate with people and talk to people and relate to them, right? And of course, it goes beyond just like communal things, right? Then what about when you have to be in a relationship, right? Stuff like that. That perspective is very important, right? And I could go on this whole thing about like the biggest arm wrestle of why relationships are so difficult is because of that men need to develop how they interpret women's perspective and vice versa, right? And that's not an easy skill. And so, I could do its own thing about that. Maybe we'll do a future podcast on that, right? But basically, the idea is that, like, yeah, when we have to take a step back on how we look the world, because it's not only through your eyes that that the world is perceived, but it's through the eyes of everyone you interact with, and so you have to be able to kind of take a stance where you look beyond your biases and other people's biases and try to look at the world objectively and try and think of like you know you view the world in a way that your impulsive passions don't just take over, so that we know how to relate to people in a good manner. So yeah, that's perspective in a nutshell. And I know obviously like this is like a Sparks Notes kind of thing, because like, dude, man, if we were to talk about perspective, we could talk for like hours. All right, there's just so much. I could do like 10 more thought experiments. I won't, but you could easily do like 10 more thought experiments on like developing perspective, and you know, there's so many, right? Because of course every hot topic that there is to talk about, you have to do thought experiments, and doing thought experiments will help you develop perspective, right? And so that's something that we all have to do, and I think it's important that we do, because then it will help us develop. It'll help us cultivate wisdom. But anyway, with that being said, though, this is going to be the end of the stream. I'll just do a bit of housekeeping before we actually close. So, first and foremost, this week is going to be pretty light, just like it was last week. So, I will not be streaming on Wednesday. So, you won't see another stream till Friday when we do our second reading of the Book of Kings. Or part 2 of Book of Kings, whatever. And the Book of Kings reading will be on Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. That was going to be quite a long stream though, because I have to actually, I feel like I should read like 6 chapters, because I'm going to do the entirety of, well, not the entirety because I already did like the earlier parts of it, but the bulk of, King Solomon's story arc. And so I feel like I'm just going to tackle all that in one stream and just read 6 chapters in one go on Friday. So for Friday's stream, 3 o'clock Pacific time, get ready for a long one, because that one's going to be quite the extensive read. And then of course, Throwback Thursdays will be on Thursdays with Heroes by Magic 2. You'll see how I deal with the Southern Kingdom that has come to challenge me in the Descendants campaign. That'll be this Thursday's episode. Next week, we'll be doing our episode 3 of the Streaming Parson podcast, or Streaming Parson podcast number 3, whatever I entitled this as. And I'll talk about something different. The first 2, I know, because it was just so much to talk about when it comes to how-to knowledge, and this is kind of like a how-to knowledge part 2, and the particulars of perspective. But we'll talk about something different next week. Probably something more goofy next week, not so serious like I am today. Something more goofy. But that will be next Monday at 4 o'clock Pacific time. So that's kind of how the next week is going to look like, right? So nothing till Thursday. We got Throwback Thursday, Heroes by Magic 2, The Price of Loyalty. And we have our Book of Kings reading stream on Friday at 3 o'clock Pacific time. So that is it. Unless you have any questions or things to ask about, inquiries in general, I guess, or other comments, place them now or forever hold your peace. But otherwise, this is going to be the end of the stream. I hope you guys, thought about, perspective and how we grow as people, right? I hope you guys, I hope I gave you guys a lot to ponder. I hope you guys have a great rest of your day. And I'll see you guys on Thursday. God bless you, and good night.